Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Hey. Today's daf is sponsored by Mona Liss in loving memory of her mother Olga Isenberg on her 6th year at site. She and her twin brother were the only survivors from their family from the Holocaust. She never had the opportunity to study the daf, but nevertheless loved learning her entire life. And today's daf is sponsored in memory of the soldiers who were killed yesterday, both in the Allenby Crossing and in Rafiach, Yitzchak Harush, Oren Hershko, Omri Ben Chai, Omri Chai ben Moshe, Ron Arieli, Eitan Avner ben Yitzchak, Ve'eran Shalom. Yehi Zichram Baruch. Okay, we're going to get started with the end of our discussion yesterday, which is really a lead-in to today's discussion. We have a very interesting sugya today, and it's going to raise a question that I bet you probably were all thinking about from the beginning of the Masechet. So the Gemara had said yesterday that I'm just going to start 4 lines from the bottom, even though we read this already, but it's a good review. So, Ema de shachet luhu shalo lishma li paslu. So now we're going to say, we're talking about this korban that was brought shalo lishma. Again, you have a korban while you're doing one of the main 4 avodot, which we proved yesterday, that we learned about all the 4 avodot. That while you're doing one of those 4 rituals, shchita, slaughtering, kabbalah, catching the blood, holacha, walking into the altar, or zrika, sprinkling it on the altar, if you're thinking about a different korban, then it's disqualified. But it's not really disqualified. Okay, let's say it like this. It's kasher. You bring the korban anyway, but it does not work for the owners to fulfill their obligation. They have to bring a new korban in its place. So now they're going to say that maybe, why? Right? Maybe it should be disqualified. How do we know that it's not disqualified? To which they bring the pasuk. Right. Well, actually, I should repeat what we did in the section just before, which was all the psukim that we showed. This whole lishma thing, and there has to be lishma, and it's important to be lishma, is all from the shlamim. How did we learn from shlamim to the other korbanot? Because there's that pasuk that summarizes Zayin Lamed Zayin in chapter 7, verse 37 in Vayikra, summarizes and says, Zot HaTorah le'olah le'mincha le'chata le'asham le'miluim le'zevach shlamim, lists all the korbanot. From there we learn what's true for shlamim is true for the others, right? Other than the chatat, which we're going to have to ask, because the chatat is also in that pasuk. The chatat is actually disqualified. But anyway, we learn from that pasuk that what's true for the shlamim, that it needs lishma, is actually true for all the rest, which is also true for chatat. It needs lishma also. But once we say it needs lishma, if it doesn't have, why don't we just say it's disqualified? To which the Gemara says, for that we have another pasuk, Motzas v'tech tishmor v'asita kasher nadarta, and then it moves from neder to nidava, and then we said, how do you have a neder that becomes a nidava? Oh, it must be our situation. It was done shalo lishma, and then it can't be brought as its original, but it is brought as something else. And now we're going to have to do the itzrich. Why do we need both? So I'm skipping a few words that I didn't read inside because we read them yesterday, but now we're going to start the very end of yesterday's daf. Itzrich motzas vatecha v'itzrich zot Torah. Why do we need both those psukim? De'ikatav rachmana motza. If you just had the motzas vatecha tishmor, what would you have thought? Lo yade b'ma. That pasuk teaches you that you have a disqualified or a problematic, I should say, because disqualified is not really disqualified, but you have a korban that wasn't brought the way it was supposed to. You bring it instead as a nidava. But we have no idea why it wasn't supposed to. What was wrong with it? It could be lo lishma, it could be something else. That pasuk wouldn't prove to us that if it was done shalo lishma, it's brought it's brought anyway, because we don't know what's wrong with it, that the neder becomes a nidava. So therefore, katav rachmana zot HaTorah. Zot HaTorah teaches us we're talking about lishma. Now how? It doesn't say lishma in that pasuk. But it says that everything's like the shlamim, and the shlamim we already know has this unique law of shalo lishma, right? It messes it up. It has to be done shalo lishma. So from there we learn the lo lishma issue, and from motzas vatecha we learn, well, it's not disqualified, okay? Even though it's not done the way it was supposed to, still the korban is brought, but you have to bring a different one in its place. What if you just had zot Torah? Then you could have learned the whole thing. No, because havamina li paslu. Because again, you would have thought it would be disqualified. So a combination of the psukim teaches you, no, it's still sacrificed. It's not disqualified. You still bring it. But again, it doesn't fulfill the obligation because it wasn't done the way it was supposed to be done. Okay. So now this creates this very strange situation again. Starting from really the beginning of our Mishna, the first Mishna here, which is you have a situation where the korban really wasn't done the way it was supposed to be. But you sacrifice it anyway, and then you have to bring a different korban in its place. So it's very perplexing, and that's kind of what we were getting at in this last section we just read. But now we're going to get very personal now. We're going to see like the ins and outs of the Beit Midrash, and kind of you see, sometimes you just see a discussion, and okay, today we're going to see a very animated discussion and something that throughout the generations people were struggling with. So Rami Reish Lakish al Mohi be Midrasha umakshe. This is a very weird sentence. Reish Lakish was lying on his stomach in the Beit Midrash umakshe and was struggling with this issue. Okay, why they tell you he was lying on his stomach in the Beit Midrash, I have no idea. It's a little bit strange why he was doing it in the first place and why they're telling you. Very good question. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's trying to set up like the struggle he was having, right? Like he was lying on his belly, and like, I just don't get this, right? You think of like a kid having a temper tantrum, lying down on his stomach on the floor, almost this image of, I just don't get this. And he said, now, this is the way we really have been wanting to ask this question from the beginning, which is, if they're kosher korbanot and they're good, right? They're using, it's not really kosher, but right? If the korban is good and can be brought, then it should atone for them and should fulfill their obligation. Im emeratzim, and if they don't fulfill the obligation, then lama ba'im, then why are we bringing the sacrifice in the first place? Just throw away the first one and bring a different one in its stead. So he just doesn't understand. He says, I don't get this. To which, what we're going to have today is a discussion between him and Rabbi Elazar. I'll remind you who they are. They're Amoraim from the first, second generation of Amoraim in Eretz Israel. Right? Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, or Rabbi Reish Lakish studied with Rabbi Yochanan but became his chavruta, and Rabbi Elazar is the prize student of Rabbi Yochanan. So we're in this Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, Rabbi Elazar. We have this discussion, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Elazar. Reish Lakish says, I just don't get this, and Rabbi Elazar tries to answer, and they're going to have a back and forth. And then later, we're going to have Amoraim in Babylonia discussing this conversation that Rabbi Elazar and Reish Lakish had. Okay, we're going to end with two kind of other Amoraim in Eretz Israel discussing it, and each one kind of saying, why didn't Rabbi Elazar respond like this? And why didn't Reish Lakish respond like that? Right? Like the backseat driver, they could have said this, they could have said that. Why not? So that's where we're going to go today, and we're going to continue this discussion into tomorrow's daf as well. It's a very central sugi here. So comes Rabbi Elazar and says to him, Amar lo Rabbi Elazar, Matzinu beba'in la'achar mita she'em ksherim ve'em meratzim. Comes Rabbi Elazar and says, we have a precedent for this. Okay, what's the precedent? Well, and I'm going to find you a korban that is brought but doesn't fulfill the owner's obligation. Okay, what's the best example? Someone who dies. Someone who separates an animal for a korban and then dies. So their heirs basically inherit this animal that was sanctified. So what do the heirs do? They bring the sacrifice as well. But it doesn't atone for them. Okay, and here he's going to bring his example. So we have an example of ba'in la'achar mita, where the animal is brought after the death of the person, that they're kshirim, it's a kosher korban, the heirs go ahead and bring the korban, but it's emeratzim, but it doesn't atone for them. It's not accepting to fulfill, the person's, the original person's obligation or the obligation for these kids. They don't even have an obligation to bring it. Ditnan, as it says in a Mishna. We're going to do a Mishna here, okay, in Kinim, which is all about the pairs of birds. Now, a woman who gives birth, she's supposed to bring either an animal and a bird, a combo, an animal for a burnt offering and a bird for a sin offering, or if she can't afford that, she brings two birds. One is an ola, one is a chatat. That's what all the Masechet Kinim, just wait till we get there. If you thought Yevamot was confusing, Kinim is more confusing. So Kinim is all about these pairs of birds. Okay? Now, it says here, now let's say she brought her sin offering, but she didn't bring the burnt offering. Yaviu yorshim olata. This is the key. The heirs bring the burnt offering. Okay, I want to just set up, because you might not have enough background about korbanot to know all this. You might know this. It might be obvious, but either which way I'm going to tell it to you. There's different categorizations, and I mentioned before that Ayelet in her introduction really discussed all these different categorizations. One of them is sacrifices that can be brought as a voluntary offering, and sacrifices that can only be brought if you're obligated in them. So let's just talk about chatat and asham, right? Those are sin offerings. You only bring them if you're obligated. You can't just say, I want to bring voluntary sin offering. Like, maybe I did a sin, so let me just bring one. You can't just do that. Okay? But you can bring a burnt offering and a peace offering. There's some that are obligatory, but you can also decide, I want to voluntarily bring a korban to the, bring a korban. One, I want to eat it, so I'll bring a shlamim. If I don't care to eat the meat and I just want to offer, I want to offer it completely to God, then I'll bring a burnt offering. Those can all be brought as obligatory offerings. So because an ola can be brought as an obligatory offering, the heirs bring her ola offering. Okay? Kind of like as a voluntary offering, but it was already designated, this animal, for an ola. So there's nothing we could do it, right? It's sanctified. That's the problem. The animal is totally sanctified. So we bring it as an ola. Okay? The heirs bring it. Ola beta. But what if she brought her ola and all that's left is the sin offering? Now that's not something you could bring as a voluntary offering. So lo yaviu yoshim chatata. So they can't bring her sin offering. Okay, that's what's called, there's these 5 chataot metot. It's one of these very hard to handle situations, which is we leave the animal to die. There's nothing we could do with it. Okay, that animal has to be left to die, and because it's sanctified, but there's nothing we could do because the owner died. So we leave it, and there's 5 situations where this happens, where we have to leave it to die. The sin offering, it's like a special chumer by sin offerings. So anyway, lo yavir yoshim chatat. But the main point is, we have a precedent with the ola. If the woman dies, the sons, now obviously they're not fulfilling her obligation. They weren't a woman who gave birth, so they're not fulfilling her obligation, and yet they bring it anyway. So here you have a case where the korban is kasher to be brought, but it's not meratzeh. So that's a good answer that Rabbi Elazar says. His answer basically is, why is it so surprising? We have a precedent. Now, it doesn't really resolve the difficulty that Reish Lakish has conceptually, but it does say here's a precedent. So Amar Le, so Reish Lakish's response is a partial agreeing and partial not. He says, Amar Le, modina lach be'ola. Okay, I'll give it to you with an ola, and things that are like an ola, like a shlamim, a peace offering. Da'atila acharmita, because those can be brought after death. But asham, delo atila acharmita minalam. But what are you going to tell me about a korban asham? Now, if a mother or a father dies, leaves a korban asham that they designated, they were supposed to bring a korban asham for something, pass it on to their children, what happens to that? Well, it's not like the chatat where it dies, but it's similar. You leave, it's a little different. You leave the animal to graze. It's called yir'eh ad sheyista'ev. Okay, this, by the way, is on your bookmarks. Okay, if you have the bookmarks, I know a lot of people got them in the mail. I know some people didn't get them yet. They're on their way. They're getting there. If you didn't get them yet, you can find them on the daf, on the recent dapim. I think it's not on today's stuff. I'll try to add it after class, so you have access to it. Anyway, the asham, what's yir'eh ad sheyista'ev? We've talked about this before, but you might not remember. It's left to graze until it gets a blemish, because what's the problem? The animal is sanctified. You can't just use it for anything you want. So what do? You wait till it can't be. Now, it's supposed to be offered on the altar, but it can't be because the owner is no longer there. So what do? Well, we wait till it gets a blemish. Then it can't be offered on the altar anymore. Once it can't be offered on the altar, we're allowed to sell it. We sell it, we take the money, and we buy what we call an ola leketz hamizbeach. You remember that term? We want always korbanot to be going on the altar. Okay? So even though these concepts are new, like in Zevachim, but there are concepts we've talked about before, so hopefully this is a bit of review. If you're new, so you're learning it for the first time now. Anyway, the point being that asham is not brought after death. You have to do this other thing and redeem it, and you can take the money and bring it. Oh, you're supposed to take the money, its value, and bring it on the altar, but it itself doesn't go on the altar. So in asham, so I get your point, Rabbi Elazar, but I'll apply that only to ola and shlamim. I can't apply that to asham. So how are you going to explain asham to me? Okay, there's no precedent for an asham that gets brought even though it's not atoning for the person. There isn't. So Amar Le, he has a very interesting answer, Rabbi Elazar, and you'll see Reish Lakish's harsh response to this answer. Hare machlotcha betzido. Rabbi Eliezer omer af asham. Do you remember our Mishna? What did our Mishna say? There's unique exceptions to the rule that are completely disqualified. What are they? Tanakama says chatat and pesach bismano. Second opinion is Rabbi Eliezer, who says even the asham. So comes Rabbi Elazar and says, oh, well, you have a problem with the asham? just go by Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. In other words, what you're talking about is exactly what Rabbi Eliezer was trying to say in the Mishnah. Don't confuse Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Eliezer, right? Rabbi Elazar is an Amora talking now, and Rabbi Eliezer is the Tana from the Mishnah. He says, you have a problem with the Asham? Don't worry, just go take Rabbi Eliezer's approach, and then you'll find. Rabbi Eliezer says, yeah, you're right, the Asham is disqualified because there's no precedent. Now, Reish Lakish doesn't like this answer, because what does he say? Amal, zeu, okay, first he responds with an insult to Rabbi Elazar. Zeu shomrim alav adam gadolhu. This is what they say, this is a great man. Ka'amina ana Mishna shlema. I was talking about the mainstream opinion in the Mishnah. I want to understand Tanakama. The Adam Rabbi Eliezer, and you try to tell me, oh, well, you're talking like Rabbi Eliezer. I want to understand the mainstream opinion, which doesn't include the Asham. So that didn't help me. Ela Amar Reish Lakish. So Reish Lakish gives up on Rabbi Elazar, and he says, Eftach ana pitcha l'nafshay. I'm going to open my own possible direction for an answer. Motzas fatecha. He quotes the Motzas fatecha pasuk. What does it say there? Motzas fatecha tishmor, ba'asita kasher nadarta, right? And then it moves into nedava. What does that pasuk teach us? That we have something that we can't bring as it is, so we switch it and we bring it as something else, meaning it's not miratzeh on what it was originally meant to. So hai nedava nederhu v'chulei kedei. They just say go look back, right? This isn't a neder; it's a neder, not a nedava. How do we get to nedava? And the whole yalla what we said yesterday. So basically, he says, in other words, gzerah katuv. Okay, this is something the Torah says, and that's all there is to it. In other words, sometimes you can't really understand things, but if they come from a pasuk, at least you know, okay, here's a pasuk that teaches it. And that's his response. Okay, end of discussion. I see you're asking where Rabbi Yochanan was. First of all, it could be Rabbi Yochanan died by then. We don't know, or he wasn't there that day. So this is the discussion. Okay, from here we're going to springboard off and discuss the things that they discussed. So let's just review the discussion very briefly so we have it really down pat. So Reish Lakish says, I don't understand this whole concept. If they're kasher, they should be miratzeh, right? Meaning they provide the atonement they did for the owner. If they're not miratzeh, then why are we bringing it in the first, right? Why are we sacrificing it? To which Rabbi Elazar says we have a precedent with the woman who's a yoledet who dies. Her children bring her korban, and obviously they're not getting atonement for it because they didn't give birth, right? And basically, Reish Lakish says, fine, I'll give it to you when it comes to an ola, okay, and a shlamim and things like that, but I don't know how you explain the asham. To which comes Rabbi Elazar and says, go with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion then. To which Reish Lakish says, I don't want to go with Rabbi Eliezer. I want to understand the mainstream opinion. And Reish Lakish himself brings his own pasuk, Matzas Vatecha Tishmor. So now we move out of the Beit Midrash in Israel and we move to Babylonia, and they're having a discussion about this discussion. Yativ Rabbi Zera v'Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba v'Yativ Abaye Kabayhu. Okay, we're going to have this situation with these two rabbis sitting, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. Abaye is Gabayu, he's there. Okay, so we're going to see they start talking and Abaye responds. V'Yativ v'Ka'amri, and they say the following. Kashile l'Reish Lakish Hasham. Okay, what they're going to have an issue with, I'll just tell you outside. They're going to have a problem with this, with the pasuk Reish Lakish brings. It's not satisfactory. Okay, Kashile l'Reish Lakish Asham delo ate la'achramita. Right, his whole problem was this asham. Right, he didn't have a problem with the ola and the shlamim. He only had a problem with the asham, the guilt offering, because it's not brought after death. V'nasiv le Talmuda, but then he brought this pasuk motzas fatecha. Now, what's the problem with bringing that pasuk? Well, ema haba b'neder b'nedava le'tivelo li'atzu. That pasuk is talking about a neder and a nedava, which are voluntary things, right? It's a vow that I take. I say, I'm going to bring a korban. That means I'm not obligated to. It's a vow. So the whole context of the pasuk he's using is all about the context of voluntary offerings. And asham, right, so maybe just things that can be voluntarily offered will be the subject of that pasuk, meaning that pasuk is teaching you leite v'lo liratzu, bring it even though it won't atone for you. But asham lo leite klal, maybe in asham you won't bring it all. So, like, where does Reish Lakish is bringing a pasuk that doesn't relate at all to the korban asham? Okay, because that category of that pasuk, the context of it is all voluntary offerings. So Amar lahu Abaye. Abaye comes in response. No, Reish Lakish mehacha patach. What he's going to do is he's going to fill in. He's going to say what you really heard about this conversation was just the tail end of what Reish Lakish said. Reish Lakish really brought two psukim. It was a combination of the two psukim, and this was the one he brought second. But the first one is, okay, now, we don't know this, but he's saying obviously he must have been basing it on something else, must have been basing it on this. V'shachat ota lechatat. Here we're talking about the sin offering. And it says by the sin offering, you slaughter it as a sin offering. Now, this teaches you lishma. It has to be as a sin offering. And that's why a sin offering is disqualified if it's not done. But what does it say here specifically? There's an extra word. You just could say v'shachata lechatat or shachat lechatat. Right? He slaughtered it, but it says ota, it. That comes to teach you ota lishma kshera v'shalo lishma psula. Hashar kodeshim shalo lishma ksherim. This teaches you the chatat has a unique law. Now it happens it's also a Pesach, but we'll go with chatat right now. Chatat has to be brought lishma. That's why it says shachat ota lechatat. It has to be slaughtered as a sin offering, not as some other offering. And if it's not done as a sin offering, it's completely disqualified. But only this. Other sacrifices that are done shelo lishma are still kosher, are still good. Okay? So you have to start off with that. And then that already teaches you that an asham, which was done shelo lishma, isn't disqualified. Okay? Meaning it's like the nidavat ones. Then, okay, so hashar kodeshim, right? So all other sacrifices, shelo lishma, would be ksherim, would be good. Now, what do you need the second pasuk for? Well, the first pasuk teaches you it's not disqualified. However, there's two steps. Number one, it's not disqualified. Number two, you have to prove, even though it's not disqualified, it's still not going to take lo alu labalin l'shem chova. It's not going to be miratza. It's not going to fulfill its duty as a sacrifice. Yachol yiratzu, and this is where in comes the part that Reish Lakish that we saw already. You might have thought it atones for the person. Talmud lomar motzas fatecha. That's why we have motzas fatecha, which is no. It's not brought as a neder though. It's brought as a nidava. Okay, it's not going to take care of your obligation. Okay, it's brought as something else. So that's Reish Lakish. Okay, now, what's the problem? The problem with this is that if you're going to say, there's two parts here. One is disqualified or not disqualified, right? And we get from ota lechatat, the rest of them are not disqualified. And then we learn from motzas fatecha, the other element, which is, but even though it's not disqualified and you bring it, it's still not going to do the ritzui, okay, fulfill your obligation. But the pasuk where we learn that from is really only about voluntary offerings. So maybe that second element that we learn from the pasuk motzas fatecha maybe isn't relevant to the asham. As we get the chatat is excluding the asham, and the asham is not disqualified. But maybe, okay, that's what we're going to say right now. Ema, okay, this is what the rabbis respond to, these two rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yitzchak, or Abba, respond to Abaye, and they say, if you're explaining Reish Lakish that way, that the first pasuk, he adds this original pasuk, right? Chatat, ota lechatat. Second pasuk, motzas fatecha, is teaching you it's not miratzeh. Ema, haba b'neder u'nidavad, leite v'lo liratzu. So say, only things that are neder nidavad, ola shlamim, that can be voluntary offerings, you can bring them and they won't atone, because that's the context of that pasuk, voluntary offerings. But asham irtsuye nami liratzu. Maybe the asham, now it's funny, first he thought the asham was more severe, harsher, like maybe it should be disqualified completely. Now we're putting the asham on the other side, which is somewhere in the middle. It's not disqualified, and maybe it can atone. Maybe we're on the complete other extreme, which is maybe the atonement actually works. If someone brings an asham, right, maybe the asham is in a situation, we're slaughtering it for the wrong reason. Doesn't matter. You can bring it and it atones completely, because the pasuk that teaches about that it's not meratzeh is only in the context of non-obligatory offerings. That's the suggestion. Now, the obvious answer is going to be, it would be a kal v'chomer though. If the voluntary ones don't work, then all the more so the obligatory ones. That's basically where we're going to go. But a bit differently, not obligatory, voluntary, but they're going to try to bring a kal v'chomer argument here. Okay? So now they're going to say, Amar Abaye. So Abaye comes to prove, this is going to be a long argument of a kal v'chomer. We're going to go through a few rounds of it. And then ultimately we're going to reject this, and then Rava is going to come in and provide a different way of understanding. Okay, but right now where we're at is, we want to suggest that if Reish Lakish's second pasuk is the one Motzas Vatecha, and that is the one that proves it's not miratzeh, perhaps that's only voluntary ones, and maybe the asham would actually also be kosher and also be accepted. So now, that is accepted to fulfill the obligation of the owner. So now Abai is going to say, Amar Abai, Asham de Miratzeh lo matzit Amr. You can't possibly say the Asham is going to be Miratzeh because of a kavachomer me'ola. We're going to learn it from an ola. How does it work? Ma ola she'ena mechaperet ena Miratzeh, Asham she'mechaper eno din she'ena Miratzeh. We're basically going to say the Asham is more severe, and therefore obviously its sin should be harsher, because in Asham atones for a particular sin. The Ola doesn't atone for anything, although we will see later the Ola does atone somewhat, but it's certainly not like the atonement for an Asham. Asham is a guilt offering. You did a sin, you bring an offering. And now we're going to say, if you bring something that could be brought voluntarily, this Ola, and it doesn't really atone, it's just a nice voluntary offering, if that isn't going to be Miratzeh, of course the one that's supposed to atone for you, once you mess up something in it, of course it's not going to be able to be offered. But what do you mean? Maybe Ola has a chumrah. This is going to be the classic kavachomer argument. Well, you could say a kavachomer as long as it doesn't have any stringency, the lenient one. But you can't say it if Ola has a stringency. We all know Ola is very harsh. Why is Ola so strong and stringent? Because mala Ola shekin kalil. It is completely burnt. It's not like a na'asham that the meat gets eaten by the kohen. This is completely burnt. That's a chumrah. But shlamim yochichu. But wait. Shlamim have the same law as the Ola. If you take the combination of Ola, we're going to now say, take the combination of Ola and Shlamim, even though Ola is completely offered, right, completely burnt, the Shlamim is actually eaten, it's even more lenient than the Asham, because it's eaten by the owners even, can eat, right? They eat their own sacrifice, as opposed to the Asham, which only the Kohen can eat. So Shlamim will prove it. But they say, no, Shlamim has its own chumrah. Mal Shlamim sheken tunim nisachim, which yes, we even saw another one, which is, right, it's also needs smicha, and it has the nisachim, the libations. They leave out the smicha on this list, and you wave the thigh and the chest. So that has its own chumrah. But ola tochiach v'chazar adin, right? This is the classic. This one has a chumrah and that one has a chumrah, but each neutralizes the other, because it's obviously not that chumrah, because that one doesn't have that chumrah, and it's not that one. So if you take the combination of ola and shlamim, v'chazar adin, then we can put them back together and return the kal v'chomer argument. Lo ri'izeh ki'ri'izeh, lo ri'izeh ki'ri'izeh. That one doesn't have the one that one has, and that one doesn't have the one that one has. Hatzara shaveh sheben. What's the common denominator? She'hen kodashim. They're sacrificial items, right? They're sanctified. Ushchatan shelo lishma sherim ve'em meratzim. And the law by them is what? You shech them shelo lishma, for the sake of a different korban. They're kosher, valid offering. They get brought, but they're not meratzeh. They don't atone. So let's learn from there to an asham. And that's how Abai proves, even though Motzas Vatecha is about neder nedava, you can really learn from Ola and Shlamim, from a kavachomer to asham. That asham would be the same. But not so good, because but Ola and Shlamim have another uniqueness, which is what? They can both be brought as communal offerings. There's communal offerings that are Ola, there's communal offerings that are Shlamim. So, but there's no communal offering for an asham. It's only individuals who bring that. So maybe because of that. Don't worry. Toda tochiach. Moving now to Amud. What's a toda? Thanksgiving offering is a type of shlamim. It can be brought right? You always bring it kind of volunteer. You volunteer to bring one, and doesn't have the chumrah of tzibur. It's only brought by individuals. So there you have it. The combination of those three. But no, malat toda sheken tuna lechem. But wait. That has its own unique law, which is it needs 40 loaves of bread or matzah, a combination of matzahs and bread, and therefore it's got something unique to it, and maybe because of that. Well, no. Ola ushlamim yochichu. Again, we're going to do the neutralizing. But Ola and Shlamim don't have the lechem, so it's obviously not that element which causes us to say it's not accepted, the korban, right? It doesn't fulfill, it's accepted, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. And again, b'chazar adin, lo ri'izeh ki'ri'izeh, lo ri'izeh ki'ri'izeh, right? This one's not like that one. All those reasons, those special, unique things, all are neutralized. Each one cancels each other out. Again, what's the least common denominator? Atzara shaveh shebehen, she'em kodashim, they're sacred. they're sanctified. Ushchatan shelo lishman kasher ve'eno meratze, and all of three of them, the shlamim, the ola, and the toda, if you slaughter them, not for the right reason, right, for the wrong korban, they're kasher, they are kosher, but eno meratze, even though you bring them, they don't fulfill the obligation of the owner. So afani avi yasham shu kodesh ushchato shelo lishmo kasher ve'eno meratze. Sounds like it's good, but they end with where we started. And they reject Abaye, as I told you. But wait, these are all unique. Now, it's not exactly a chumrah, but they're all unique in the sense that they come b'neder u'nidava. You can bring them as voluntary offerings, and the asham you can't. And because of that, this whole logic of, well, if it's true for that, it's true for that, it's really not necessarily. And therefore, we're left with a big question. How do we get from Motzas Fatecha? How did Reish Lakish bring that as a pasuk to prove his issue about the asham when that context is neder, nidava, they're voluntary offerings. And the asham can never be brought as a voluntary offering. So Abaye is stuck. Comes in Rava with an answer. Ela Amar Rava. Zot HaTorah. We go back to where we started today's daf. It's the combo of Motzas Fatecha with Zot HaTorah. Now what does he say here? Hikishoa katuv l'shlamim. You're worried about, we get that shlamim. First of all, we learned the whole thing from shlamim yesterday, that you need it to be lishma. Then we have motzas fatecha, which is talking about, among other things, the shlamim, which is, it's not meratzeh. So he says, ma shlamim shem kodshim, ushchatan shelo lishman kshirim ve'em meratzim, afani avi asham shu kodesh. Because again, the pasuk compared shlamim to all the other korbanot. And what was in the list? Asham. So what's true for shlamim is true for asham, and now we get it from there. Okay, that's actually pretty simple. There's one question on this before we move on to the next section. Umay chazit akash l'shlamim, akish l'chatat. But wait, if you noticed in that pasuk where we compare everything to shlamim, or where we came up with this hekesh juxtaposition, but chatat appears in the pasuk also. So why don't you just say asham is like chatat, right? And therefore asham will be disqualified completely. And that's because of what we learned before. Hamiyet Rachmana Otah. Remember the Otah drasha? Only the chatat has to be lishma, and if it's not, it will be disqualified. That's only a law for the chatat, not for anything else. So if we're going to compare anything in this pasuk to anything, it's going to be to the shlamim, because it's not going to be to the chatat, because the chatat already, we said, based on the word otah, only this one has its unique halacha that it will be disqualified, nothing else is disqualified, and therefore we can learn from shlamim. And again, this time we're learning from shlamim a few things. We're learning number one, which you really could have learned from that it's not disqualified. But number two, it needs lishma, it's not disqualified, and, which really you could have learned not disqualified from otah l'chatat. That's also already. But really what we're learning here is that it's not meratzeh though. Even though it's not disqualified, it can't serve as a chovah. Okay, so that was what we did so far, in really simple terms. We had a back and forth discussion between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar tried to help answer Reish Lakish's question, but was unsuccessful, partially unsuccessful. He proved it by the Ola using the precedent of the woman in childbirth, but he couldn't prove the Asham, to which Reish Lakish comes up with his own pasuk to prove the Asham. And what we did in this last section, long last section, which took almost a whole amud, was to basically explain how Reish Lakish's proof worked. It was missing some basics, and then kind of had it really work. It took us till we got to Rava to really understanding the full way that Reish Lakish kind of started, He said, Patach, I'm going to start to answer my question, how he answers it from the psukim. And it ends up being really a combo of three psukim, We need the otah l'chatat, we need we need a bunch. We need otah l'chatat, we need the motzas fatecha, and the vizot haTorah. Okay? And the combination of the three gets us to Reish Lakish. Now we're going to have three rabbis sitting around. Okay? Yativ Rav Huna v'Rav Nachman v'Yativ Rav Sheshet Kabei. And then we're going to have after Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet and Yativ Rav Ada Bar Matna Gabayu. And in each of these sections, we're going to have, and we're only going to start the second one today, we're going to have a question on, it's going to be like the backseat driver. Why didn't Rabbi Elazar say this at this stage of the conversation? And why didn't Reish Lakish say this at this stage of the conversation? Okay, so the first one is going to be about Rabbi Elazar. Yativ Rav Huna v'Rav Nachman, and then Yativ Rav Sheshet Kabayu. So Rav Huna and Rav Nachman start speaking, V'yatve v'ka'amrei. Kasha le'le Reish Lakish Hasham. What Reish Lakish in the end was really struggling with was the guilt offering. Delo ate la'acharmita, because it doesn't come after death, right? That was his whole claim. You can't bring it if the person dies. And that's why this isn't like the ola, which you can bring. So you gave me a precedent that the ola could be brought after death. Because it could be brought after death, I understand that it can be brought and it won't be miratza, and there's our precedent. But the asham is never brought after death, so there's no precedent. But lema le Rabbi Elazar asham nami ata la'acharmita. Why did Rabbi Elazar respond and say you can also bring an asham after mita? How so? Well, you can't really bring the same animal, but what can you do? What did we say? It's left to graze until it gets a blemish. Once it gets a blemish, what do? We turn it, we sell it. We take the money, we buy a korban with it, and we bring it as an ola. So what do you see here? In the end, it is brought. Now, just its value, but it is brought into the temple. So it can be brought after death. In the end, that animal, so its value, is brought to the temple as a sacrifice. So there you go. We have a precedent. So why didn't Rabbi Elazar answer that? Amar lahu Rav Sheshet, Asham lamai karev lemotaro. Chatat nami mikrav karva motara. So they say, in Asham, how is it brought? It's brought as its motar, meaning it's just brought, its monetary value is brought. It's not, the actual animal isn't brought. And in fact, a chatat also, you can bring its motar. Now, I told you that the chatat's meta, you don't bring it. But there is one case where the chatat, you actually could bring it to the temple. What is that? So, if I decided, Rashi explains the case, Kigon hifrish shte chataot la'achrayut. It's at the very top of the daf, about 5 lines from the top. Chatat nami motaron nedavahu. There could be a case where a chatat is brought as a nedava, which is what? If I decided, I'm a little bit of a worrier, so I have to bring a sin offering, and I take 2 animals, and I say I'm separating 2 animals for this chatat offering, knowing that I'll probably only bring 1, but what if something happens to 1? I want to make sure I have what I need. So I designate 2 animals. I can actually, in that case, it's not the same as I designated an animal and then died, okay? Or I designated the animal and then the animal got lost and I took a different one instead. That's different. Those have to be left to die because I really designated one and then I really designated the other. Here, it was like semi-designation because I knew I wasn't going to use one of them in the first place. So what do? You take one of them, you use it, and the other one, you leave it to, the other one you leave to graze, and when it gets a blemish, you redeem it. So that's not a good example because it's just like the chatat. To which they say, no, but a chatat, afagav de karva motara mi'et rachmanahu. You could say it's the same, and theoretically the chatat should have been able to, right? And as again, what are we trying to say? We have a precedent for Asham that is sacrificed, just like the Ola is sacrificed. Now again, it's a little different, right? That's the whole thing. Well, it's motar. But even the motar, right? So the motar, the chatat also is the motar, right? But the chatat's motar, it doesn't really matter that the chatat is brought as a right? As an extra thing because mi'eh rachmanahu. In other words, you could say that the Asham theoretically is like the chatat. It's going to be disqualified or it's, right. Then you would say, just one second, you would say that the chatat, the asham, since it's only the motar and it's not really a precedent, right? It's just the monetary value, it shouldn't be sacrificed at all. But then we have this chatat hu, which excludes that from being disqualified. So you might have thought the asham is going to be disqualified, but it's not disqualified because only the chatat's disqualified, and we have a special drasha, which is hu. Okay, this, by the way, is different from the otah. It's another limitation. Chatat hu means this is, chatat has its own unique laws, and it's not true for the asham. So now they say, so that's again to say, why didn't Reish Lakish why didn't Rabbi Elazar answer that the asham can be brought after death? And the answer is because it can't really be brought after death. It's just the motar. And then they say, okay, but the motar, then it puts it in the same position as the chatat, but no, it's still not going to be in the same place as the chatat because the chatat has a special drasha. Okay, now, if we're going to darshan it for this word hu, and only the chatat and nothing else, asham nami k'tiv behu. The asham also has this word hu that's unique to the, right? Which sounds like maybe the asham is just like the chatat, that it's disqualified. So they say no, because the context of the hu in chatat is different from the context of the hu of asham. You have to really look at the whole pasuk. So let's just start with the chatat pasuk. Samach yado al rosh ha'seir, v'shachat oto b'makom asher yishchat et ha'olah lifnei Hashem chatat hu. So it says, right, you put the smicha on the seir, he slaughters it, and it's a chata. Now, it's all in the context of the slaughtering, which is the time when you have to do it lishma. So you could say, chataru, this is a unique halacha. It has to be done as a sin offering, not as anything else, and only by chata. By Asham, it says, V'tir otam kohen hamizbecha ishel Hashem asham hu. It's talking about a later stage. After the 4 main avodot, which are the ones that have to be lishma, are done, right, the shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. After that, you take these certain parts of the animal and you burn them on the altar. Now, that part is not critical, and that's where it says asham hu. So that's in the wrong context. That's not in the context where it's all about lishma or not lishma. So that's what the Gemara says. You can't use that to teach that this is going to be disqualified if it's not done lishma, because that's lachar taradi murimu dichtiv. It's said in the context of after the burning of the parts on the altar, and as it says in the Braita kedetanya, aval asham lo ne'emar bohu ela lachar tarati murim v'uatzmon lo tiru murim kasher. You don't even have to do aktarati murim. Forget about doing it lishma. If you didn't do that, okay, you're supposed to do it, but if you didn't do it, the korban's fine, because you already sprinkled the blood. That's the main part of the korban being accepted. Korban's accepted even if you don't even do that part. So for sure, the asham who can't be teaching you that it's disqualified if it's not done lishma. Ela hu lamali. This is now, we're just off on a tangent. So what's this who for? L'chidr Rav Huna Marav. You need it for Rav Huna Marav. To Am Rav Huna Marav, asham shenitek l'riyah ushchato stam kashir. Nitek in, lo nitek lo. If you took this asham, let's say it was supposed to be brought, got disqualified. So what do you do with it? You leave it to graze, right? The animal, you leave to graze, or something happens, right? Like, for example, the person died, the owner died, the asham is left to graze, and then, now it's not supposed to be slaughtered, but what if someone took it and brought it into the temple and slaughtered it without any intent for anything? It goes as an ola, because once you take l'riyah, once you put it to graze, its trajectory right now is to be a korban ola. So if you do it stam without any particular intent, we assume, right, remember we talked about the intent of lo lishma as a problem. You do the wrong intent. But if you do no intent, it just goes as it was supposed to. Now, what was it supposed to? Well, at this point, once you sent it off to graze, it was supposed to be an ola. So it'll be an ola. But before, lo nitek, before that, and you just slaughter it, it's nothing, because it can't be an asham. And it's still, in other words, until you send it to graze, it stays as an asham, and that's what we learn from the word hu. Now we're going to read it. My taima amarkra hu behavayato yehi. It stays as its original status. Okay, until you do something like send it to graze. Okay, so that's just an aside about what the asham hu is coming for. Now we get back to our argument. Yativ. So that was all this first question they had. Why didn't Rabbi Elazar say asham nami yita lachar mita? And the answer is because asham really isn't lachar mita, because it's the value of it, not the animal itself. Yativ Rav Nachman Rav Shesha Yativ Rav Ada Bar Matna Gabayu Yatve v'Kamri. So now we have Rav Nachman Rav Shesha, and they say the following in front of Rav Ada Bar Matna. Hadika Amar Rabbi Elazar. Okay, now we're going back to a line Rabbi Elazar says, and then Reish Lakish didn't respond what he could have responded. We're going to say, why didn't Reish Lakish say the following? Matzinu b'ba'in la'achar mitah she'em kshirim ve'em meratzin. Right? Rabbi Elazar says we have a case after death. We have a precedent. What's the precedent? The woman who gives birth, her sons bring her korban, but of course they don't get atonement from it. Lema le Reish Lakish hanunami leite v'lichatzu. Now this starts a whole discussion that's going to continue on tomorrow's daf. Why don't we say that these people will bring, the sons bring her korban and they receive atonement? Maybe it does work for them. So Amar Lam Rav Ada Bar Matna, Yoledet. What kind of a crazy thing is this? Im Hiyada, she gave birth. Baneha Miyaldu, did they give birth? That they're getting something out of this, that this Ola is atoning for them? Right? They didn't give birth. You can't possibly say this worked for them. To which Matkefla Rav Asi, Rav Asi says, what are you talking about? Of course you could. Because an Ola has something additional to it. An Ola atones for sins that if I didn't do a mitzvah aseh, okay, a chata and ashamar, I did some terrible thing, right? I did something wrong, a negative transgression. What if I didn't do a positive commandment? So anytime I bring an ola, even for a different reason, it atones for any sins I've done since the last time I brought an ola that I didn't do a positive commandment. Okay, I just didn't take a lulav on Sukkot or something. So man lemala di kakama ase gabalo mit kapra, right? When she brings her ola, that she's bringing because she was a woman who gave birth, but it's also obviously going to cover any mitzvah ase that she didn't do. Since there might be some mitzvah aseh by her, mikapra, it will atone for her. Your shanami mikapru. Why don't we say that it covers these kids and any kind of mitzvah aseh they didn't do? So now, in order to say that, you have to say, and this leads to a whole big question, but L'meimra dekanya lehu, that means they acquire the korban. In other words, there's two ways they could bring their mother's korban. Either they just bring it as kind of like her messenger, like she missed it, so we'll bring it on her behalf, but we don't own it, or they actually own it. Now, if we're suggesting that Reish Lakish could have said, but it does atone for them, and therefore this isn't a precedent for what we're looking for, we need something where it doesn't atone, why didn't Reish Lakish say this could atone? So this whole suggestion suggests and assumes that they acquire it, because only if they acquire it themselves will they be able to get atonement for it. So now they say, but wait, how could you say they acquire it? And now we're going to have a whole back and forth with different sources. They're going to either prove they do acquire it or they don't acquire it. So now we're going to show they don't acquire it, because Ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan, hiniach mincha l'shnei banav v'meit. If somebody leaves a mincha offering for two sons, and the person dies, we're going to learn in a second that you can't bring, two people can't bring a mincha offering. A meal offering can only be brought by one individual, not two people together. If two people own a mincha, isn't brought. So if someone leaves a mincha to his two sons, now you're going to see where this goes, and he dies, meaning he left it to them because he died, kreva ve'ein bo shutafut. It's brought because they don't jointly own it, which means they didn't acquire it. If they acquired it from the father as an heir, they acquired it, they wouldn't be able to bring this because it would be a combined ownership. And isa gadata kanya, if you think so, nefesh amar rachmana. It says only a soul, an individual, can bring a mincha offering. Ve lo kanya. Right. Okay. Amar rachmana, period. Okay, so it seems like they really don't acquire it, which would explain then why Reish Lakish didn't answer this, because if they don't acquire it, they can't possibly get atonement. Now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, but lo kanyu, they don't acquire it, and now they're going to bring another source, which I'm going to leave for tomorrow's class, which is, we're going to start from there, which is, this source is going to seem to indicate they do acquire it. So we're going to have it back and forth until they conclude one way or the other, and we'll see that as we go on. So what we really did today, besides dealing with, in the very beginning, those first two psukim and why you need each one, then we started with this question that Reish Lakish asked, this basic question about the lo lishma. How could we have something that gets sacrificed, but it doesn't atone? To which Rabbi Elazar said, we have a precedent for it with this woman. And then he says, well, that only helps us with an ola and voluntary offerings. What about an asham? To which, right, he tries to say, go take Rabbi Elazar's shita. Reish Lakish gets all upset, and then Reish Lakish brings his own pasuk. And then what we dealt with from there on was, number one, Reish Lakish's pasuk, how do you really prove that pasuk? And we had to, in the end, say it's really a combination of three pasukim. And then we had these two questions. Why didn't Rabbi Elazar say the asham nami also comes after death? And why didn't Reish Lakish say that's not a precedent at all? Because maybe the sons get atonement. And we're right now in the middle of a discussion. Is it possible the sons really could get atonement from that ola or not? And we're going to have to see where this discussion goes. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and should have Besorot Tovot B'Karov.